April 20th, 1945. In a cellar beneath an apartment building in Berlin's Wilmersdorf district, a 34-year-old journalist pressed her pencil to paper by candlelight. Above her, the building shook with each artillery impact. "We're breathing dust," she wrote. "The radio still claims the Führer is in Berlin and will stay in Berlin, but nobody believes anything anymore." For weeks, Berlin's remaining civilians had watched their world contract. 3 million people, mostly women, children and men too old or broken to fight, had stayed in a city that had become a tomb. The young men were gone, fed into the collapsing fronts. The Nazi Party officials who'd spent years promising victory were quietly fleeing west, toward the Americans and British, away from the Red Army advancing from the east. The civilians left behind had been told what to expect if the Soviets came. For months, Goebbels' propaganda ministry had filled the airwaves with warnings. The Bolsheviks would murder every German. They would burn the city. They would rape every woman and girl. The propaganda, built on real atrocities committed by German forces in the Soviet Union, now returning as a prophecy of revenge. But propaganda competed with exhaustion. By mid-April, most of Berlin had no electricity. Water came from public pumps if you were willing to risk the artillery fire to reach them. Gas lines had failed. Food rations had dwindled to near nothing. People lived in cellars, emerging only when necessary, listening to the artillery creep closer each day. On April 16th, the Soviet offensive began. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by over 6,000 tanks and 41,000 artillery pieces, launched the final assault on Berlin. The sound reached the city as a continuous thunder, day and night. In the cellars, people counted the seconds between impacts, trying to judge the distance. April 21st. The first Soviet reconnaissance units reached Berlin's eastern outskirts. Most civilians didn't know this yet. The Nazi radio continued broadcasting reassurances. Relief forces were coming. The Führer had a plan. Victory was near, but the artillery was no longer distant thunder. It was inside the city. Inge Deutschkron, a Jewish woman who'd survived in hiding throughout the war, watched from a window in her secret apartment as Wehrmacht soldiers ran past. Not marching. Running. They weren't retreating in formation, she would later testify. They were just running, throwing away weapons, tearing off insignia. That's when I knew it was over, when I saw German soldiers running like that. In the cellar of an apartment building near Tempelhof, the journalist who would later publish her diary anonymously as a woman in Berlin listened to the sounds changing. The artillery was constant now, but something new had appeared. Small arms fire, machine guns, the crack of rifles, street fighting, and then, on April 27th, a sound that made everyone in the cellar freeze. Voices outside. Speaking Russian. "We could hear them clearly," she wrote. "Russian words, Russian laughter. They were right outside our building. We'd known they were in Berlin for days, but knowing and hearing are different things." One woman started to pray. Another vomited. Most of us just sat there, staring at the ceiling, listening to boots on the street above us. The moment of realization came differently for different neighborhoods. In the eastern districts, it came first. In Wedding, in Prenzlauer Berg, in Lichtenberg, Soviet soldiers appeared on April 22nd and 23. In the central and western districts, it took longer. But everywhere, the realization followed a similar pattern. First, the change in sounds. Then, often, a German soldier running past, no longer fighting. Then, the voices speaking Russian. Then, the boots on the stairs. Margaret Bovary, another journalist who remained in Berlin, recorded the moment in her diary. April 24th. They're here. Everyone keeps saying it to each other, as if we need to confirm it's real. They're here. The Russians are here. We say it in whispers, even though there's no reason to whisper anymore. What we feared, what we hoped wouldn't happen, what we knew would happen, has happened. What struck many civilians first was not what the Soviet soldiers did, but what they looked like. Years of propaganda had painted them as subhuman Asiatic hordes. The reality was more complex and in some ways more frightening. They were exhausted men who'd fought across 2,000 miles, who'd seen what German forces had done to their homeland, who'd lost friends and family, and who'd been told Berlin was their prize. A woman living near the Reichstag described the first Soviet soldier she saw. He was young, maybe 20. He looked as scared as we were. He had a submachine gun, and his hands were shaking. He kept looking around like he expected someone to shoot him. He saw us in the doorway and shouted something in Russian. We didn't understand. He shouted again, then gave up and moved on. We stood there for a long time after he left, not knowing what to do. But fear had a basis in reality. What followed the first tentative encounters was a wave of violence that Berlin's women had dreaded and that would scar the city's memory for generations. The anonymous diarist recorded it with unflinching detail. Soviet soldiers, often drunk on looted alcohol, went door to door. They were looking for watches, which had become a strange obsession. They were looking for food, and they were looking for women. The first time they came to our cellar, they had flashlights, she wrote. They shined them on each woman's face. They took the younger ones. We could hear them screaming in the apartments upstairs. The older women tried to hide the younger ones, but there were too many soldiers. They came back again and again, different ones each time. The scale of sexual violence in Berlin remains debated by historians, but all serious estimates are horrifying. Anthony Beaver, drawing on Soviet and German archives, estimates that at least 95,000 women and girls were raped in Berlin. Other historians suggest the number could be much higher. The anonymous diarist's account, corroborated by countless other testimonies, describes it as near universal among women between ages 13 and 70. What makes the testimonies particularly harrowing is the matter-of-fact tone many survivors adopted. It's not a question of whether, but how often and by whom, the diarist wrote. We've developed a strategy. The older women offer themselves to protect the younger ones. If you can attach yourself to a single officer, he might protect you from the others. It's not safety, it's just better than the alternative. Gerda, a 40-year-old mother hiding with her 2 teenage daughters, left a testimony collected by Cornelius Ryan in the 1960s. When they came, I stepped forward. I was older. I thought maybe they would take me and leave my daughters alone. But they pushed me aside. They wanted the young ones. I tried to fight. They hit me with a rifle butt. I woke up later, and my daughters were sitting in the corner, not speaking. We never spoke about it. What was there to say? The violence was not uniform. Some Soviet soldiers showed restraint or even kindness. The diarist describes a Soviet officer who posted guards at her building to prevent further attacks. She describes soldiers who shared their rations with starving children. She describes one who apologized in broken German for what his comrades had done. But these moments of humanity existed alongside systematic brutality. The contrast itself was disorienting. In the morning, a soldier might give you bread, one survivor testified. In the evening, a different soldier might assault you. There was no pattern, no way to predict. You just had to survive each moment as it came. The other immediate realization was about food. Soviet soldiers looted systematically, but they also brought food from their supply lines. The diarist describes the strange economy that developed. Women traded what little they had, including their bodies, for food. Soviet soldiers, many of whom came from peasant backgrounds and had survived on near-starvation rations themselves, couldn't understand why German civilians were starving in such a wealthy city. A Soviet soldier asked me why we had no food, Margaret Bovary wrote. I tried to explain the rations, the supply breakdown, the siege. He looked around at the buildings, the furniture, the possessions we still had. He said something in Russian I didn't understand, but his meaning was clear. You had everything. You invaded us, and now you're starving? He couldn't reconcile the Germany that had invaded the Soviet Union with the Germany he found in Berlin. For many Berliners, the realization that the Red Army was in the city came with another, more devastating realization. Everything they'd been told was a lie. The victory that had been promised for years was not coming. The relief forces were not coming. The Führer's secret weapons would not save them. The Nazi Party officials who demanded total loyalty had fled. They were alone, in a destroyed city, facing the consequences of a war they'd supported or at least accepted. This psychological reckoning appears repeatedly in the testimonies. We believed, one woman told an interviewer decades later. Not the extreme propaganda, maybe, but we believed Germany was in the right. We believed we were defending ourselves. When the Russians came, when we saw what happened, we had to face what we'd supported. It was worse than the physical suffering, the knowledge that we'd been on the wrong side. The suicides began before the Soviets arrived and continued for weeks. Exact numbers are uncertain, but estimates range from 3,000 to 7,000 in Berlin alone during April and May 1945. Whole families died together. The most common method was cyanide capsules, distributed by Nazi officials to party members and others. When those ran out, people used other means. A Soviet soldier, interviewed years later, described finding an apartment where an entire family had died together. The parents, 3 children, and the grandmother. They were dressed in their best clothes. There was a note on the table. It said they preferred death to dishonor. I was 19 years old. I'd fought from Stalingrad to Berlin. I'd seen terrible things, but that apartment, that family, that note, it stayed with me. For those who chose to survive, the next realization was practical. They had to find ways to live in a city that was no longer functioning. Water had to be carried from pumps under threat of artillery fire. Food had to be scavenged or traded for. Bodies in the streets had to be stepped over or around. The smell of death was everywhere. You adapt, the anonymous diarist wrote. You'd think you couldn't, but you do. You learn which streets are safer. You learn which Soviet soldiers to avoid and which might help you. You learn to recognize the sound of different artillery. You learn to sleep through bombardment. You become someone you wouldn't have recognized a month ago. The battle continued around them. Wehrmacht and SS units, including many boys from the Hitler Youth, fought on even as the cause became hopeless. Civilians were caught between the fighting. Soviet soldiers, taking casualties from snipers and ambushes, became more brutal. The violence fed on itself. In the cellar beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler spent his final days issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, blaming everyone but himself for the defeat. Above ground, the civilians who'd believed in him, or at least accepted his rule, faced the reality he'd brought them to. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. Most Berlin civilians didn't learn this immediately. The Nazi radio continued broadcasting for another day, claiming he'd died heroically fighting Bolshevism. When the truth emerged, the reactions varied. Some felt betrayed. He'd promised to stay in Berlin, to lead the defense, and instead, he'd killed himself. Others felt nothing. They were too exhausted, too traumatized, too focused on survival to care about the fate of the man who'd led them to this. When I heard Hitler was dead, I felt nothing. One survivor testified. I'd felt everything already. There was nothing left to feel. He was dead. We were still here. That was all that mattered. May 2nd, 1945. The German commander of Berlin, General Helmuth Weidling, surrendered the city. The battle was over. The shooting gradually stopped. In the cellars, people emerged cautiously into daylight. The city, they found, was barely recognizable. Whole blocks had been reduced to rubble. The streets were cratered. Bodies lay everywhere, German and Soviet, soldier and civilian. The smell was overwhelming, but the artillery had stopped. That alone felt miraculous. The silence was strange, Margaret Bovary wrote. We'd lived with constant noise for so long. When it stopped, it felt wrong. We kept waiting for the next explosion, but it didn't come. The war was over. We'd survived. Now we had to figure out what that meant. What it meant in the immediate term was Soviet occupation. The violence continued, though it gradually decreased. Soviet military authorities began establishing order, but the process was slow and uneven. Civilians had to register with the new authorities. They had to find food. They had to start clearing rubble. They had to bury the dead. The anonymous diarist continued her journal through June. Her entries chart a slow, painful adjustment. The acute terror of the first days gave way to a grinding daily struggle. She describes learning Russian words. She describes the complex relationships that developed between occupiers and occupied. She describes women who attached themselves to Soviet officers for protection and provision. She describes the judgment other women passed on them and her own conflicted feelings. "We do what we must to survive," she wrote. "The women who judge others for their choices, who claim they would never do such things, they're either lying or they haven't been hungry enough yet. Survival has no dignity. It just is." The psychological toll of what Berlin's civilians experienced would reverberate for generations. Many never spoke about it. The anonymous diarist's account, when first published in Germany in 1959, was met with hostility. Germans were not ready to confront what their women had endured, or to acknowledge the role their own nation's actions had played in bringing this fate upon them. Decades later, survivors began to speak more openly. Their testimonies revealed the complexity of that moment when they realized the Red Army was inside Berlin. It was terror, yes. It was the culmination of years of fear, but it was also the end of years of lies. It was liberation from Nazi rule, even as it brought new suffering. It was the consequence of a war their nation had started, coming home to them personally. "We knew what our soldiers had done in Russia," one elderly survivor said in a 2005 interview. "Not the details, maybe, but we knew. We'd heard things. We'd seen the propaganda about the East. When the Russians came, part of me thought, this is what we deserve. But another part of me was just a terrified woman who didn't want to die. Both things were true at the same time." The moment when Berlin's civilians realized the Red Army was inside their city was not a single moment. It was thousands of individual moments in cellars and apartments and streets across the city as the sounds of war changed, as Russian voices replaced German ones, as the reality they'd feared and denied finally arrived. What they said in those moments varied. Some prayed, some screamed, some sat in silence, some made dark jokes, some tried to maintain dignity, some collapsed, but underneath the variety of reactions was a common thread. The world they'd known was ending. The future was uncertain and terrifying, and they would have to find a way to survive it. The anonymous diarist, Marta Hillers, captured it in a single line, written on April 27, 1945, as Soviet soldiers entered her building. "This is it," she wrote. "Everything we feared, everything we knew was coming. It's here. And now we find out who we really are." Berlin's civilians found out who they were in those days. They were not the master race the Nazis had proclaimed them to be. They were not the victims they would sometimes later claim to be. They were human beings, capable of courage and cowardice, kindness and cruelty, endurance and collapse. They were people who'd supported or accepted a regime that brought catastrophe, and who now faced the consequences personally and immediately. The Red Army's entry into Berlin was the culmination of the most destructive war in human history. For the civilians who experienced it, it was the moment when history stopped being something that happened elsewhere and became their immediate, inescapable reality. What they said in that moment, what they felt, what they did, reveals the full complexity of human nature under extreme duress. And in the end, most of them survived. They cleared the rubble. They rebuilt. They carried the trauma silently for decades. They became the grandmothers who wouldn't speak about the war, the mothers who flinched at loud noises, the women who'd learned that survival sometimes requires choices that can never be fully reconciled with dignity or justice. "We survived," Marta Hillers wrote in her final diary entry in June 1945. That's all, we survived. Whether that's something to be proud of or ashamed of, I don't know anymore. But we're here, and we have to figure out how to keep living